Hello, and thank you for joining. We appreciate you being with us. If you're joining today, we are assuming that you care about equity and justice in some way. Today is about how you can strengthen your strategy to best advance that. My name is Anand Dalakia. I will be your host and practitioner today. I'm a principal associate at Community Science, and I've been in the equity and justice space for nearly 2 decades now as a strategist, first and foremost, and also as a capacity builder of organizations, as a facilitator of groups to work toward common goals, and as an evaluator.
Today, we're going to try to leave you with a number of things over the next hour. It's a big topic, but we're going to try to cover as much as we can. And so for any program areas that you may be focused on in your philanthropic organization or other roles that you're playing, first is we're going to share a strategy approach to help you steer your attention and resources toward the better odds of equity and justice success. That's first and foremost. Second is my panelists are going to help share examples of what this looks like in the real world. Third is, beyond that, a macro view that can help you increase clarity and connect the dots maybe across various streams of your work, and to help tell a coherent story about that work. Hopefully there's some nuggets in here that you can use for that. And finally, we're going to share how strategy can link some of your other efforts to action and results, such as if you're working on evaluation, on internal DEI work, and work around improving your culture, organizational culture, and practices like grant making and such. We see the strategy can often complement those things and link that to other work as well. So to get to all of that, we are going through, this is the flow for the next hour. So I'm going to go first, and I'm going to start with defining equity and justice as our common grounding. We need that because strategy to advance it obviously depends on that. We'll talk about very common gaps in developing strategy as far as equity and justice is concerned. And then we'll talk, the meat is closing the gaps and 5 principles to help close those. Then I will stop and I'm going to bring the panel on to give examples of these concepts and what those look like in real life, and have time for Q&A, and then leave some thoughts for you all to move forward with. And we have a fair number of people on this webinar. We know that we're not going to get to every question or every thought that comes up, but let's say we hope this is the start of a conversation. We're happy to follow up in various ways after this. We'll give you information for that. And lastly, before I introduce the panel, just a few little housekeeping things. We know how this works, most of us by now, a year later, but we're recording the session. We will share all of the materials. Please enter any questions into the questions box. The chat is open for general reflections. And it wouldn't be a webinar without some tech issue, would it? So if something breaks, please bear with us. We'll pause it. We'll fix it and get back on track. So I want to introduce you. Let me introduce the panel, I'm so excited to have this representation of philanthropic leadership with us today to share their wisdom and reflect on this content. First, I have Dr. Rhea Williams-Bishop, who's serving as the Director of Mississippi and New Orleans programs at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Rhea is responsible for leadership and vision of grant making in Mississippi and New Orleans. She supports and facilitates the community change process within the region in alignment with the Foundation's mission and strategy. And she works in collaboration and partnership with grantees, external partners, and Kellogg Foundation staff. Prior to joining the Foundation, Rhea served as the director of the Mississippi Center for Education Innovation, a nonprofit education intermediary focused on impacting and transforming education. Welcome, Rhea. So glad to have you. Next, I have Noelle Doward, the Senior Advocacy Program Manager at the Colorado Trust. Noelle directs, designs, and implements advocacy, grant-making strategies, and supports the integration of evaluation and learning into all of facets of the work. Noelle led the first grantee-driven advocacy strategy at the Trust, building a new field of health equity advocates across the entire state. And Noelle currently leads the Building and Bridging Power strategy at the Trust, which is investing deeply in rural and urban grassroots community organizing, the infrastructure for that. It's strengthening policy-making processes to be driven by community priorities and solutions. And the strategy is building relationships between grassroots and grass tops organizations and communities. Welcome, Noelle. And Jillian Rosen, I'm so happy to have, is the Vice President for Community Investment at the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation. Jillian oversees the Foundation's impact investing, grant-making programs, community initiatives, and strategic partnerships. Most recently, she completed a 2-year fellowship in place-based impact investing with Common Future, learning how to deepen philanthropic investment capital in service of community. Previously, Jillian worked in the nonprofit sector on issues around social justice, poverty alleviation, and youth engagement in philanthropy. All very relevant expertise and in real-world experience as relevant to this topic today. I appreciate all three of you being here so much and can't wait to get you on to reflect and share these real examples. I think for the audience, for all of you to note that there is a diverse cross-section of the philanthropic space represented here, between a national foundation and focusing on a place, a statewide health foundation that focuses on equity, and a community foundation, one of the fastest growing in the country right now. And so there's a diversity of perspectives that hopefully each of you will see something relevant to your own situation. So we will bring the panel up soon. I am going to try to limit my time. This is my favorite topic, and I'm going to try to get through this as fast as possible to talk about what strategy looks like for equity and justice, and hopefully why all of you are here. So the first thing is to walk through a quick definition of equity and justice. And this is how we define it. And there's all three parts of this are critical to when we talk about what strategy needs to look like. First is that all people, equity and justice means that all people can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, regardless of race, first and foremost, regardless of other demographic characteristics such as class, and also place of residence. Second, we will have equity and justice when people, especially from communities that are historically disadvantaged and excluded, have these three things: fair access to opportunities and resources. Second, the right to obtain them, those opportunities and resources, as respected by the law and freed from discrimination. And third, the capacity to take advantage of them. All three of those are important. And lastly, and I want to emphasize this part of the definition because this leads into a lot of the strategy we'll talk about, to achieve equity and justice requires recognizing how our institutions, systems, policies, and narratives have perpetuated inequities and injustice for generations, knowingly or unintentionally, and addressing the power differences behind this. This part is critical. So looking at grounding ourselves in that definition, I want to ask this somewhat rhetorical question, but the chat is open for reflections. How good is your strategy at advancing equity and justice based on how we've defined it? You don't have to answer right now. We're going to walk through some things to help you answer that now. First things first is what I like to call the basic art and science of good strategy, looking at strategy as a discipline. What is good strategy? What separates it? And it's, don't need to overcomplicate it. I start with this definition. It's about maximizing the odds of success through four things. One is meaningful goals. So having a vision and definition of what's most important to accomplish. Second, a path to get there. These are now getting more concrete around priorities, activities, and interim results. Number three, a clear why. This is essential. The underlying logic, rationale, and assumptions that explain why those goals, why that path. And lastly is continuous improvement this aspect of monitoring, iterating, evolving, improving the strategy as things change. Is inevitably things change and evolve in this unpredictable world we live in. It's not static. Those are the basics. So now reflecting on very common approaches to developing strategy in the philanthropic field and sector, and then across the social sector in general, there's a number of gaps that I'd like to highlight. And each of you can reflect on your own process and see how these show up. And maybe they show up or not. But 6 things to name, I think, and watch out for. Number 1, the first gap is, ironically, strategic planning. And the gap is thinking that going through a robust strategic planning process will lead to a good strategy. Not guaranteed. It can be 2 different things. Second is what I call the strategy label. And this looks like a list of activities or big outcomes like, and these are real examples that I'm citing that I've seen, use data, build partnerships, address inequities, and then calling that a strategy. I would argue that those are not strategies, but they're parts and considerations and such that go into one. Number 3, this is my favorite, but what I fondly refer to as Starbucks strategy. And this is essentially comes from all of the corporate and private sector guidance that was put on philanthropy and the entire social sector in terms of how to do strategic planning. And it goes something like this: find that one magic silver bullet solution and just replicate it on every neighborhood block, like a Starbucks location. And then later on, define what social problem that's solving around that solution. Like this Starbucks cup, there's a lot of comfort in that, but it leaves a gap when we're talking about equity and justice. Number 4, segmentation. This is the carving out, thinking that strategy, approaching strategy in a way that means I'm going to name this one social issue that I'm going to work on and leave out everything else. Right? And it could be definitely part of a planning process, but with dividing out narrow social issues and by deciding who to target in terms of age group and demographics or education or employment, carving those out can also leave a gap and lead to missed opportunities for shared progress against common issues, which we'll see. The 5th one I call quantify and predict. Many of you know this one. It's this idea that strategy needs to depend on an exact goal that needs to be achieved within 1.5 exact years exactly, and claimed with 100% attribution by my institution. Also can lead some missed opportunities. And lastly, it's the equity and justice label. And this pattern is, and it's been very common over the past year, is basically starting with existing big strategic plan or strategies and trying to add on equity and justice after the fact, which not a bad thing in itself, but again, can lead to some missed opportunities. So things to watch out for, and that leads us to now, what do we do about it? And the 5 principles to help close these gaps. So first one, principle 1, is to lead with equity and justice. It's not just the lens. Number 2, recognizing the big problem to solve. Principle 3, prioritize what makes change happen. Principle 4, understand the universe and philanthropy's place in it. And principle 5, remove false limitations and stretch your comfort zone. Now, we could do a full session and then some on every one of these principles. We don't have that kind of time today, so I'm going to give you a brief snapshot of each one of these. And then we can dig in deeper as we bring the panel on and see where you want to go. But one at a time, I'm going to give you a flavor of each one of these. So principle 1 about leading with equity and justice starts with embracing equity and justice as the end goal, not just as a lens or an add-on or an afterthought. It's starting there, especially recognizing how this is at the core of most social issues that philanthropy and many of our organizations may be working on, whether it's education or economic opportunity. There are core issues of equity and justice there. Right? Second is to honor community expertise. And here I'm talking about communities that have been excluded and marginalized, communities of color, communities that are living under stressed economic circumstances. Starting with honoring that expertise so that we go beyond just simple processes of engagement, gathering input, etc. It goes beyond gathering input or giving voice to actually listening and valuing what is said and incorporating that into strategy, into grant-making practice across that. And third is to check assumptions, biases, mindsets. I'm going to come back to this theme. And even just saying those two things, just talking about embracing and honoring, checking what mindsets and biases are coming up at the notion of doing that among yourselves, others in your institution, other partners you may be working with. Okay. That brings us to, that sets the stage for the other principles. Principle one. Principle two now, with that grounding, is about recognizing the big problem to solve. This is all about naming why do disparities exist in the first place. In other words, the root causes, and especially recognizing what keeps them in place. So I'm going to do a quick illustration of what this big problem looks like in a way that should apply to almost any program area that you may be working on. And I'm going to start with this. Now, to frame this, looking at the big problem, at the top here, we see general life stages of life that all of us go through. The exact stage, the exact definition does not matter for now, right? It's generally, we're born, we get older, we go to school, we try to sustain ourselves and go into older adulthood. Across all of those stages, we all have mostly common needs around housing, transportation, food, etc. Okay? And we know that based on unending data that there's significant racial and other disparities across every one of these stages. One stage leads to the next, and disparities in how well people are able to meet their core needs. Right? And starting with racial disparities, class disparities, and then based on other demographic characteristics. One big focus area of work is addressing those disparities through this the category of programs, services, and resources. And we know that for every one of these stages, for all core needs, most of us are involved in one way or another with program providers, service providers that address these head-on, working with communities day in, day out. And a lot of work here we know is not just the delivery of these programs, but also scaling them, improving how they work, coordinating them, making them work better. Right? And we also know that this area of work, it can make all the difference to people, to families in marginalized communities, and it's where a lot of attention goes. And we also know that to look at why disparities are happening, to start digging up the big problem, that we need to go one level deeper to now start looking at what are the underlying systemic conditions that communities face day in and day out. Right? And this looks like things like from left to right, lower access to quality early education, lower quality schools, right? Even in the same school district. Great discrimination in hiring and advancement, and there's significant data over decades that shows just how stark these conditions are across the stages, and also when we're talking about core needs. Okay? And we know that beyond the data, that if we talk to residents of communities, if we talk to service providers that are delivering those programs, they will say the same story. It's not just data, it's not just reports. Firsthand experience confirms all of this. If you walk into a neighborhood and talk to people, it comes up in conversations. I think service providers, especially who I spend a lot of time with, they notice day in and day out, right? And see it makes their jobs harder. Right? And so we know that this is an essential part to pay attention to. And the last question, last piece of this puzzle is to ask, well, why do systems act this way, right? Why lower quality schools for communities that are disadvantaged and marginalized? This is the last piece in this quick root cause analysis that we're doing. And underneath these systems are a few common themes, right? A few common patterns around, well, communities have very limited decision power over what their lives look like. There's this thing called systemic racism. And related to that, negative narratives that say that consistently that communities that are marginalized and disadvantaged and excluded, it's basically their fault. It's a matter of behavior and changing behaviors, right? And underneath, finally, and this is one of the most critical parts before we move into the strategy about what to do about this, is at the bottom, right? And I think it's most commonly overlooked, is this set of incentives that prefer the status quo, that prefer what systems look like today. Right? These are political, economic, organizational incentives. And the point is that systems do not look this way by accident. It's not just dysfunction. It's not just limited awareness. They've been looked like this for a long time, for generations, and it's for a purpose. And that is essential to consider when we're talking about now a strategy to advance equity and justice. And so just to make it a little more clear, I'm going to put this big highlighted orange box around it in terms of what the big problem looks like and what that means for moving into principle 3, which is what to do about it. Last thing on this slide, we're talking about systems, right? And we can see it in here, at the bottom here. Systems include your school districts, your city councils, land developers, decisions around where city funding goes, employers, a big one, right? Corporations and small businesses. These all are stakeholders in the systems that are now shaping what communities are experiencing day in and day out. Okay. So the question is now, based on this big problem, what do we do about it? And that leads us to principle 3. And you have to remember that systems have looked this way for a long time. The big problem has been there for a long time. And people have been trying to tackle that big problem for a long time, since the founding of this country, really. And so this principle is about prioritizing what can make progress against that problem. And the first thing to encourage you to do is to shape your macro strategy, to anchor the micro, shape that macro strategy first, and then make space for change levers that address the big problem. Okay. And I'm going to give you a sense of what these look like. And I'll go one at a time. And these cut across all social issues, all program areas again. The first is this lever around building community power. And so here we're talking about strengthening community capacity and connections and the influence to shape what systems look like. Complementing that is this lever around messaging and narrative, around spreading messaging to help shift those negative narratives around communities that have been excluded and disadvantaged, and to build public and political will. Third is policy advocacy, advocating for those policies and practices, but driven by community priorities. That connection is essential. Fourth is this lever around lifting up models around policies and practices that are showing a new vision, showing showing how systems can be reinvented or transformed to work better on behalf of communities, and backing that with models and data and showing examples. Right now, there's a lot of work around economic flipping, what economic security looks like, employee ownership to change the employer-employee relationship, things around guaranteed employment, things like that are examples that are pretty big right now, and especially around what policing can look like, a very relevant topic for today. And fifth is the levers, paying attention to those decision points, where systems decisions are being made and who has what power around those decisions and targeting those places. Now, all of these are not exclusive. We're not saying that they're exclusive. They're not silver bullet solutions. Right? It really goes back to think about them as strategic priorities to maximize the odds of success. And there are roles for all types of organizations across the sector to take some of these on, foundations and nonprofit organizations, intermediaries. And in your foundation strategies, then it's about determining how to prioritize these, how to support them, who to work with in making these happen. And lastly, if we look at this as a macro strategy, it can provide context to all of these other very common investment areas, right? Around leadership development, capacity building, evaluation, research. Looking at these now in the context of these change levers can help give it some shape, some guidance, and help. It can lead to any of these things at the bottom looking a little bit different, right? If you're approaching evaluation or capacity building in service of one of these levers up top. Okay. I'm going to run through 2 more principles and then bring the panel on. Principle 4 is based on those change levers. The next step in the strategy is to understand the universe and your place in it, and really understand the full ecosystem, going beyond what may be your usual networks, and how to best contribute to that, versus the other way around, versus making all of the work about the foundation as an institution, but more seeing what's out there. In this part, you can consider all possible roles for the foundation, and then there's this point about thinking local, because the local level is so important. I'll give you a quick snapshot of this ecosystem. So one way of thinking about it, just a few buckets. We always put community at the center. There's a lot happening in terms of community-based organizations and neighborhood groups. And again, thinking about who's building community power, who's organizing, who's helping, who's working on residents' behalf. Around community, we have these 2 buckets of stakeholders that are engaged in advocacy or delivering programs, or both, very common. And around that circle, we see philanthropy and intermediaries as being part of this picture, trying to support in different ways. And lastly, on the outside, we have the systems, the stakeholders that I talked about that are shaping the conditions that all of this operates within. And so for those in philanthropy and those of you who are not in philanthropy, and think about, who else is working in these buckets. Looking at these categories can bring up a number of important strategy considerations that can help in how you're developing strategy, how you're going about the planning process, such as these: who's addressing the big problem in your world, right? Who's implementing the change levers? Where's there momentum and common ground, areas of shared interest? What needs to be amplified and how? What are the gaps, and what are our own ideal roles to play? All important considerations. And in terms of philanthropy, playing your own roles, you can look beyond grant making, right? Other roles to consider: being a champion, being a convener, bringing people together around a common issue, other ways to leverage those assets that philanthropy does have. Quick point about thinking local is look local. We know that zip code greatly impacts what one's conditions look like, and that can vary in a matter of blocks. These maps show household poverty rate in cities across the country: big cities, small towns, rural areas. The same is the graphics, the shape looks different, but the pattern is the same. And so whatever issue you're working on, if you're working in state, regionally, nationally, it's even locally, a lot of the equity and justice picture can arise by drilling down to seeing how does this play out in different neighborhoods, even in a small town. And the red, dark red areas are those, of course, with a higher poverty level, and the green are more wealthy areas. And you can see this level of segregation that impacts nearly every issue that you may be working on. Last thing, and we know this is a big one, right? And in this principle 5 is about removing false limitations and stretching your comfort zone as you're thinking about what's possible in strategy, right? And you can think about each of your institutions as kind of a mini system has its own incentives and requirements and dynamics. And I think the panel will be talking about this we talk about this a fair amount. It's a very common conversation, but the principle is about really assessing your standing criteria. What are the criteria that you have for making grants, for making investments, and in assessing, what's solid, what's not, what deserves to be a criteria or not. Second is comparing any perceived risks that may be coming up to the risk of continuing the status quo, right? Make that comparison. Third, checking on the underlying mindsets or assumptions, biases that come up again through this conversation or this thinking. And lastly, naming the boundaries that need to be pushed. This came up in conversation with the panelists a little while ago, and so we added it. I think is a great explicit thing to pay attention to. And we'll continue this conversation about what needs to happen internally to allow the strategy to happen, because we know strategy does not exist in a vacuum. It's a function of the culture and what you're working on internally. So we want to recognize that. The last thing I'm going to leave you with before I bring the panel back on is, especially over the past year, right, after the murder of George Floyd, we're a year into COVID, there have been a lot of calls to action on systems leaders, mayors, police departments, employers. There have been a lot of calls to action on how to do better for equity and justice, how to work better on behalf of communities of color. And strategy, the way I see it, philanthropic strategy is building on all of that great work to name those calls to action and those recommendations. And strategy is about how can philanthropy fulfill its role and maximize its role in realizing those calls to action, because of everything we talked about, systems and what keeps systems in place. This is where strategy can really come in. Right? So thank you all for joining for this first part of the presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to our panel. Anyone who started multitasking with the presentation, I'm going to welcome you back now to the conversation. And Jillian, Rhea, Noelle, I love that you are with us right now to reflect on this. And we're going to have a little bit of conversation we're going to hear from each of you, and then have a group conversation, and then take a look at the questions that are coming in from the audience. And in my excitement, I forgot to introduce myself, so I'm going to do that now. My name is Anand Dalakia, Principal Associate at Community Science. I have been in the equity and justice space for about 2 decades now, it's scary to say, and I've been a strategist first and foremost, and coupled that with capacity building for organizations, for foundations, and grassroots groups and grasstops groups, and I've also coupled it with facilitating groups toward common goals. So, I see all of that going together in addition to measurement and evaluation, and really so happy to be with you, to have all of you joining us. Jillian, Rhea, Noelle, I'm going to ask you these 4 questions, and for the audience to follow along, looking at these principles that I just went through and the change levers. How and why do the principles and change levers show up in your philanthropic strategy? Second, how do you know what's working? Third, what gets in the way anywhere, and how do you overcome it? And then finally, fourth, where do you hope to go next? Right? And what are you excited about? I will leave it to you to jump in and take turns. And I'm going to take a sip of tea now and rest my voice while you all take over.
Good afternoon, everyone. And Anand, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak alongside my peers and colleagues, Noelle and Jillian, on such a wonderful topic. And thank you for this presentation. I will definitely be using and referring to these principles as I move forward in my work, in my career. So, racial equity is really the cornerstone of our work at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, because we know it's necessary for meaningful and lasting change. At the foundation, our focus has always been on children, but we know that children live in families, and families live in communities. And for children to thrive, their families need to be able to provide for them, and then their communities have to be equitable places of opportunity. Yet, we know too many communities are not places of equitable opportunity, as our grantees and partners know and have to deal with on a daily basis. Based on the decades of programming, we recognize that racism is the root cause and the primary obstacle to all children thriving. And you just very eloquently highlighted that in your presentation. The Kellogg Foundation has been making investments to advance economic equity since our inception in 1930. And then in the 40s, we began making grants to disable and dismantle the crippling effects of racial equity in healthcare professions serving all across the US in various hospitals. And this was the beginning of our programmatic work, which has certainly evolved over time. And we've learned that for institutions to really tackle racial equity, they needed to do the internal work first. And I know that's not the focus of our conversation here today. We're talking about overall strategy, but know the internal work goes hand in hand with any external effort that any of us are engaged in. And we started to really take a look at the foundation from this vantage point to see where we needed to change, starting with our own diversity and inclusion efforts. And then that was the beginning of this journey that we're still on today. We basically, we have to walk the talk. For many of you on today's webinar, your organizations are on this journey as well. We're at different stages. Our trustees declared the W.K. Kellogg Foundation an anti-racist organization in 2007. In 2018, we created our DNA theory of change. And it's comprised of really three major components, and that's racial equity, community engagement, and leadership working together on approaches to achieve equitable outcomes where all children can thrive regardless of their race, their ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. And if you hear LaJune Montgomery Taborn, our president and CEO, in any speech or conversation, she's always referring to the foundation's DNA. And these are exactly the values that Anand raised as key components to change in this work. So our approach to community engagement is unique because it's grounded in our founder's idea of community engagement being a continuous process, cycle of cooperative planning, intelligent study, and group action, which goes right along with those principles. And when we talk about the community engagement formula, I think it's very important to keep these things in mind. Cooperative planning is a focus, the focus on the ways in which we convene partners, residents, organizations, the way we elevate community voice. It encompasses the way we link national and local partners, and then how we provide resources for collaboration and help them build their capacity to create a shared vision. Next is intelligent study, and it involves the process of building knowledge that will help foster the change, things like mapping formal and informal networks, collecting the data and information, analyzing the policies and their impact, researching history in the community and the narratives, and then building community profiles. And lastly, group action is a concerted effort of multi-sector partners across our focus areas, collectively designing and implementing that community vision. The roadmaps, the blueprints, the strategies, all this based on building relationships and trust in communities. And then at the center of this engagement formula, we have community leaders, and they have to be the catalyst for change and the ones who can best determine what the needs are in any given community. So as we work with the community to try to identify and develop these relationships and remove barriers in decision-making structures. So we're very intentional about supporting the capacity of institutions that have made a commitment to racial equity and leadership. And we also see it as our duty to nurture the capacity of local leaders through professional development, and then make sure we engage communities in a way that leads to racial equitable outcomes that can be tracked. Now, I guess one good example is our CLN fellowship program in terms of how we build out these leaders. We're finishing up cohort 2, about to move into cohort 3. But where those leaders are in community across all of our targeted priority places, they're doing phenomenal work around the equity issue. So, it means including people of color as leaders, experts, researchers. We're very careful not to allow groups to come in, study communities of color without establishing trusted relationships, and that goes a very long way. It means inviting residents in the community to participate and shape those outcomes and strategies. And it also means investing in collaboration across multi-sectors, including business, government, nonprofit. So let me give you one clear example before I close out my comments. We did some work here in Mississippi with a school district. I don't know if you all heard about what happened with the Jackson Public School District. It was about to go into be taken over by the state Department of Education. And we came up with what we refer to as a third way. We brought the governor, mayor, foundation officials, other leaders together to come up with a plan of action so that they wouldn't be taken over. So the governor was to appoint a commission to oversee the process. And his selections were 5 white men over the age of 50. Well, there was one black male in the group. And we talked to community, got insights from community, and they said, this definitely will not work. We need to have representatives from the community. We need parents of the school district. We need highly thought of principals and administrators. We need the neighborhood grandmother on the corner who's concerned about education. We need some business leaders. So we ended up with a 15-member commission represented across the gamut across the community of Jackson, and came up with a successful process and strategic plan. And the district is doing much, much better. Short of COVID, we'll see after we end this process. But just wanted to give that to you as an example. So I'll leave you with these questions to consider. How are you getting people involved, and when are you getting them involved? What does full engagement of the community look like? And what is your role in catalyzing their engagement? And the last question, are you being intentional or haphazard in your equity efforts? And I'll stop there. And I can answer some of the other questions, Anand, when we get into the Q&A. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Rhea. So much to follow up on there, but let me go. Noelle, Jillian, do you want to do rock, paper, scissors? Just volunteer. No, okay, Noelle unmuted first.
Jillian, is that okay if I go? Okay. Yeah, thank you, Rhea, for sharing so much about Kellogg and both the history and where you are now and how you work with community. It's really helpful to hear. At the Colorado Trust, it sounds like a bank. We're not a bank. We are statewide in Colorado, meaning we work with rural communities and folks as well as urban. And while we say we're a health equity foundation, I think that's just a really big tent. So I'm thankful that we've moved beyond asking other people to tell us how their issues relate to health equity. And we've really recognized that racial equity is at the center of any other kind of equity focus that we should have. So my role at the Trust is I direct our advocacy grant making, as Anand said, and I thought I would just talk about a specific strategy, a specific area of work at the Trust, and sort of layer that in with the principles that were shared today and how they show up in our strategy. So first, just a little bit of sort of how we got here. So the Trust focuses on policy and advocacy because we believe that there's good policy and bad policy, and both can last for a really long time, and has. Systems of oppression and systemic racism last on purpose because policy has been enacted to make it so, and it keeps certain folks in power. And that we also believe that the best policy and advocacy work will be driven by community, by folks most impacted by inequities. And so we've evolved, I guess, our policy advocacy work to live more truly into those things we know over time. And when we built out the Building and Bridging Power strategy, which is our most recent and current advocacy grant making strategy, it's not like we came up with those ideas ourselves, sitting inside the trust, or not from our own lived experience. Part of my role was to really learn from and think about what we had done in the past in our field building work, and where we didn't make a lot of progress, and where we were unsuccessful in supporting the grantees in making progress. One of those areas was actually having the policy, infrastructure, and environment really driven by community. That work takes a lot of time, and it requires dedicated resources. We also had a scan done, because of course, philanthropy likes to have reports, but also, since we have a health equity mission, a lot of people don't see themselves in us, because people think health and they think individual responsibility and doctors' offices and insurance. That's not all that health is. It's not everything that creates health by any means. So we really wanted to do a both and of understand better what the organizing ecosystem looked like, and then also help people know that we could be partners with them, even though our mission says health equity. So fast forwarding just in some of the areas around mindset, we had to recognize that there isn't only one way to build power or to organize, and it looks different in different places and different contexts, and that all sorts of organizations and people can contribute to that work. The trust is not an issue-based funder. We don't have policy priority areas. We really are centered on the idea that the only way things are going to change is if people have power to change them. So we wanted to support people and organizations in building that power and deeply invest in grassroots. So the big problem isn't exactly the system that I think we're pointing to throughout this, or we could, but necessarily like, what is the organizing infrastructure that enables people to build power? What do they need to do that? Can we support them over a longer time frame? And can we be, as the trust, sort of a catalyst for other funders to see themselves in this work too, and then put resources behind it? And so prioritizing what makes change, organized people and resources and money helps make change. A policy infrastructure that is responsive to community creates change. Accountability journalism that holds power holders to account and investigates why decisions are made and illuminates where they're being made, builds power. And then I think understanding philanthropy's place, I come from the nonprofit sector and maintain a very healthy critique of philanthropy as an institution and its historical origins. And so I think part of our role is to really think about how do I show up? How do we show up? How do we support folks with the issues that are most important to them and the capacities they want to build, and not have an assessment sort of to layer over, what I think an organization needs to build or how they need to build it. So I have a lot of opinions. That could also be its own webinar on the role of philanthropy in justice and equity work. And then I think some of the false limitations that we've tried to address, we made it really clear that we were willing and wanted to support organizations that had never had philanthropic funding or any funding. We wanted to support volunteer groups. We wanted to ensure that it was grantee driven as much as possible so that they can identify their own capacity building needs and resources. And it's not like we don't have ideas of what would happen, right? Like we have outcomes we think might happen. We have some sketched out ideas of indicators, but the most important thing I think we're doing is having a focus on learning. And to what extent are we making progress? How do the funded partners that we're working with think about these questions that we're asking? How do they want to answer them? Are these the right questions? And really engage them all along this process. So Building and Bridging Power is a 4.5-year initiative. It's general operating funds and separate capacity building funds. It has a learning and evaluation plan that is meant to be additive, not accountability focused. And it's really the first strategy that's deeply investing in organizing infrastructure and policy infrastructure that the trust has put forward. And it really is going to try and support those policy advocacy grass tops organizations, which are only 1/3 of the grantees, who are really dedicated to shifting the policy infrastructure and their own work to be more community driven, as well as 2/3 of the resources going to grassroots or organizing and power building organizations. So I think I covered the principles. I didn't quite talk about how we know it's working, except a little bit in the evaluation. And there's a whole lot that gets in the way that we can talk about maybe as a panel, but I want to make sure Jillian has time.
Thank you, Noelle. Jillian, you're up.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that I got to go third, because I could just say like ditto and ditto to everything that Rhea and Noelle shared, and then we can get our time back as a panel. But really, I mean, I'm not sure you saw, but my head just nodding along to everything that you have brought and are living into the work of equity and justice, and that it's not just a moment in time, but it's a living, breathing, continuous part of who we are or who we can become too, right? It's and so I thank you for your leadership and contributions to this work in your communities and to our field. So I am at a community foundation, and so you know, that fourth principle of thinking local, like that's all we are. We are local, and something that I believe in our work as a community foundation is that place matters. Place matters so much, and I appreciate that across the country we see patterns, but place and context really matter. And so I'm just going to give you a snippet about my community that I get the privilege to serve, because I think it matters to the tactical examples that I'll show, that I try to highlight some of what Anand brought to us today. So Ann Arbor, Michigan is located in Washtenaw County. We are a county of 350,000 people. We have 5 institutes of higher education in our community, and about 40% of our population falls into the ALICE population, so asset limited, income constrained, and employed designation that the United Ways really piloted. And by 2022, it is estimated that we will have 2% unemployment in our community. So we have 40% ALICE population and likely in the next year and a half, 2% unemployment. We are the 8th most economically segregated county in the country. There's nearly a 20-year disparity in lifespan based on both race and zip codes. So an entire generational gap in our community of resources on lifespan. Black infant mortality is twice that of white infant mortality in our community. And much like I'm sure the communities you are in and have served, you can see that our Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities were disproportionately and adversely affected by the pandemic, both health and economically. And that's certainly occurring here in Washtenaw County. I don't want to say it's bleak. I'm innately a hopeful person, and I think our communities can work together to do better and change these outcomes for our community and for ourselves. When my community fails, I fail. If my community is not thriving, I'm not thriving. So I am as much part of all those statistics that I read, and they are a part of me. So in the lead principle, I'll share that we as a community foundation have just started to pivot from equity as a lens to equity as leadership. And it's just starting. Last year, our board adopted 5 new core values, one of which is equity. And that has been truly transformational on how we can think about how we show up in community. Basically about all the other 4 principles, we can now ground that in equity. But that was not possible until our board did that internal work, Rhea, that you talked about, and our staff did that internal work, and we were able to language it and come to a shared agreement on what that means, and how we pursue that. So it's really exciting. It's also really scary. We don't yet know what we're doing all the time to pivot from a lens, which is safe. And it's like, well, we can put it over there, right? We have our lens, and it is a bit scary to shift into other places. It feels like we're building some new muscles along the way that we just haven't had before. So in recognizing the big problem, I'll share that in our healthy and fulfilling aging work, which we used to just call aging or older adults, it's much more affirmational now, healthy and fulfilling aging. Before we went through a strategy process, I would say that we would have probably done our grant making and associated it with all the the outcomes that the medical model tells us need to happen for life, for older adults and aging, right? That very medically based, and right, it's really about healthcare reduction costs, keeping people out of the ER, don't use ambulances, right? So we probably would have been funding things like that. But because we went through a strategy learning process, we understand now that one of our core roles in understanding the big problem is shifting mindsets. Anand likes to ask a question sometimes, like, who here is aging? And the first time he asked me that, I did not put up my hand. Okay, I did not see myself in aging. I'm aging. We are all aging, and shifting the mindsets is where we're focusing our work with healthy and fulfilling aging. Because it's not about the resources not being there; they're there. It's about the perspectives we bring to aging and those who are farther along on that journey that really inhibits healthy and fulfilling aging. Having that macro strategy anchored to the micro really speaks to what we try to do at the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation. We have a higher education strategy for degree attainment, trying to close inequities for first generation youth of color and economically disadvantaged youth in getting to and through college. What we've understood there is that the higher education systems themselves present a lot of barriers, right? Like, we could provide all the scholarship we want to students in those three populations, and they're still not going to graduate with a degree. And so we've really layered in the micro of everyone in our program gets a dedicated success coach, because you need help navigating systems that are not set up for you. So the coaching, and we also have a life needs fund. So once a student tells us, I need money to fix my car, we write them a check, or now we wire it to them. Right, that it is not just about scholarship getting to and through higher education. It is access to resources that most of us have and some of us don't. And so when they tell us they have a need, we write a check. And it is simple as that. And tomorrow they can fix their car, and the next day they can continue going to college, as opposed to having to make some really tough choices. And we have the resources, so why not, right? What we've also learned, connecting it back to the macro, is that universities have a, and I'm getting really tactical here for all those out there that might be scholarship providers. Universities have a process where they displace outside scholarship. So here we are trying to help students who have lack of access to resources and therefore opportunity. And a university will take our $4,000 scholarship and reduce that student's institutional aid by $4,000 and still send them a bill. So that micro has now put us in a place where we are advocating at the state level to change that regulation so that our students have as much access to resources, fair access to resources, in order to capitalize on that opportunity. And if we weren't connecting the micro to the macro, we probably wouldn't be in this space of advocating for change. Understanding the universe and understanding the role we play in that. I'm going to actually not be micro on this one. I'm going to be somewhat philosophical. There's a researcher and educator out of Temple University in the Philadelphia area. Her name is Dr. Corwin Berman, and she recently wrote a book about philanthropy. And in it, she said, philanthropy can be at its best when we're bridging between democracy and capitalism. And so we think about, and I think about that as our role in any one of these, right? Democracy and capitalism are major, major ideals and values and systems. And I hope they're here to stay, particularly democracy. And so can philanthropy bridge those two so that our communities are best served by the positives each system has to offer. And then removing limitations. So challenging that status quo is why I wake up in the morning, which, my husband is not always thrilled with in our morning breakfast conversation, but there you go. So for example, we, used to not make grants to individuals. Well, turns out you can do that really easily. And you know what? Speaking, Rhea, about the community leaders and the community powers, well, they deserve to be fairly compensated for their expertise, for their time. And so now we pay people and compensate them for their expertise, where before we would have just said, don't you want to just come to this meeting and lead it for us? No. We can compensate them with our grant dollars. The students that I talked about in our higher education, we send them cash. Okay, you can do it. It is okay. We can get over that hurdle. I think the other limitation that we are moving through and trying to break down is the idea that equity or racial equity is divisive. We are rejecting that idea, and we are saying that actually our job is to create broader shared common ground in this work, and we are not leaving people behind. That's not how we're going to achieve that equity and justice. And so a limitation of even a couple of years ago in myself, which was like, you know what, if they're not on the train's leaving, and that's just too bad for them. We're really rethinking that and interrogating ourselves that no one should be left behind, because then we'll just end up in another inequitable place.
I'm not going to follow that. Thank you, all of you. I think you answered the questions and then some. And thank you all so much for bringing 3 different perspectives to the same topic. Right? And I think there with some alignment, and then also some with unique points. Just a quick time check. We're a few minutes past 3. We have a lot of people still with us. So thank you for everyone who's still here. We have a few questions. Let's do this. Let me do the panel. I don't know if you can stay on for a few minutes. There are some kind of specific questions. Let me just, for anyone who needs to leave, I'm going to just say, well, Q&A, it's been open, but thank you all so much for joining, for spending this time. We appreciate and value the time that you did spend on this critical topic at this critical moment in history, which we know is just a continuation of hundreds of years of history based on what we've talked about. For any additional questions, or if we didn't get to what you're answering today, we're happy to follow up. My contact info is down there. You'll get it in the email. If anyone's looking for tips on your strategy or look at that, we're happy to provide that in a light way as well. And for anyone who can still stay on, and Jillian, Rhea, Noelle, if you're here for a few more minutes, I am going to. So we have 2 questions, and I think both are good ones, right? So one is around the indicator. I'm collapsing into 2 topics. One is what have you found to be the most meaningful indicators of progress in the work that you described? That's one. And then second is it was for Rhea specifically, but all of you described this in many ways. Is what are specific methods that you have used to engage community members? Right? So I'll throw those 2 out there for now. That's probably what we have time for. And then I think with anything else, we're happy to follow up with people. But for all 3, I think whichever of those 2 that you'd like to share a few examples around would be great. So indicators of progress, and how do you engage community members?
So I'll jump in quickly on indications of tracking progress. So I'll start internally. In one of our, what we call Huddle Week, where everyone comes to Battle Creek for a meeting, all staff meeting, we had our director of human resources to basically share with the entire team, percentages, like what percentage of staff members at WKKF are people of color, the number of board members who are people of color, the percentage of contractors and our grantees. So we use those internally in reports so that we can monitor and be accountable to ourselves. And then we also ask those kinds of questions in our proposal grant announcements. Whenever you fill out an application, those are the kinds of things that you have to ask, because we lead with our DNA, which is racial equity. Now, some specific methods of engaging folk, I'll use the Jackson Public School example. We did everything from hire local consultants and contractors to knock on 68,000 doors to get them to complete a survey in terms of what they wanted to see in the school district and how they wanted change implemented. We also held, paid and supported grantees to hold meetings, community meetings by ward and district, 7 of those meetings, to hear from the community directly. So all of that information was then provided to develop a strategic plan of how the district would move forward. So I'll stop there and turn it over to you, Jillian and Noelle.
Oh, we don't have good indicators yet. Totally, to be totally candid. We have outputs, and I think that what we have is a growing shared line of sight with community and our grantees. But that messy middle that strategy starts to answer, we haven't figured that out yet, and we haven't frankly been doing enough or in the equity space to know long enough to know. So and we're okay with that for right now. And I would encourage you to not hold back from doing the work if you can't find the perfect indicator. I think the work can still be done.
And thank you for flagging that. I think in terms of one of the strategy gaps, when we talk about quantify and predict, that having that as a requirement, I think it's watching out in this space, if you're committed to equity and justice, not letting that be a criteria on the front end that may prevent from implementing something that we know will, based on hundreds years of history and decades of struggle, letting it prevent investment in what may work. Noelle, indicators of progress or methods to engage members of community.
Well, we just had a conversation about our evaluation and learning plan today, which we're taking a different approach for the building and bridging power strategy than we've taken in the past, which is to define high-level learning questions and think about some evaluation questions that we could have answered. But most importantly, in my mind, is that our external evaluators and consultants are asking the grantees about what they want to learn or what indicators they would anticipate, knowing that those could change over time. So community organization sure has, for good reason and good opinions about what policy advocacy organizations would do or how they would look if they were really centering community and power, and vice versa, and also about themselves. So I think it's way less about what the trust considers as an indicator of progress and way more about the folks doing the work, what they hope to see or what they want to see and how they define it. And then the trust's job, in my opinion, is to be flexible and adaptive and say, oh, we never expected that, or we weren't sure that was going to happen, and then learn about it and talk about it. And I think it's also a little hard, I found personally in the policy space, for folks to kind of get away from, well, we passed the bill, so that's an outcome or that's an indicator. And that's not the end of the story at all in a policy advocacy strategy, especially one that's centering building power and organizing. So there isn't necessarily one, and there's not one methodology, but I think my takeaway is that the folks doing the work are the ones that need to answer that question, not me.
Good answer in a way that doesn't answer the question, but no, perfect.
I'm so good at that now.
Yes, excellent. And let me, I'm going to call out the example that this was happening during the civil rights movement as well. I think just looking at, so decades ago, there's been a lot of study on the role of philanthropy in supporting this type of work that we're talking about now. Only then it was the original organizations and MLK and the SCLC and these same dynamics, this exact same conversation happened back then too, is how can philanthropy support, but without prescribing the exact outcomes and such, but that ended up happening, right? So the Fords and the Rockefellers ended up getting into this exact kind of dynamic, starting to define the indicators and the necessary outcomes and prescribing it and making it about the foundation versus, fitting into the universe, right? So in terms of that principle, so, and it's being echoed again. People are not leaving. It's like, I have to go pick up kids from school. So can I bring you all back? Can I invite you back for a part 2?
That would be great.
Another session?
Sign me up.
Excellent. So thank you so much for all the conversation. Thank you for everyone who's been attending today. Even if you're multitasking or not, thanks for at least having a window up. And we'll be sharing everything via email on the website. So this recording and the slide materials and adjacent materials that this content is based on, and we'll be happy to follow up on conversations, or if you want to look at your strategy. And with that, Jillian, Rhea, Noelle, thank you so much for being with us